40 million ballots have been cast across the country, which already accounts for a quarter of the total votes in the 2020 cycle. You've probably heard that Republicans are overperforming expectations, with registered Republicans voting early or returning mail-in ballots at an unusually high rate. Let's dive into the data and build out a 2024 Electoral College map based on these numbers to assess whether Democrats have reason to be concerned at this stage. NBC News has a great tool tracking mail-in and early in-person voting across most states. As of this recording, 42% of these ballots were cast by registered Democrats, 40% by registered Republicans, and 18% by independents or third-party voters. It's no surprise that Democrats have a slight edge early on. Historically, they favor mail-in and early in-person voting, while Republicans tend to show up more on Election Day itself. With that said, the real surprise is how narrow the gap is. So rather than taking these numbers at face value, we'll dig deeper into polling data, demographic trends, and prediction markets to get a clearer picture of how things could shake out. Let's dive in. To start, the 4 states already marked as solid Republican on this map, Missouri, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Alabama, are those where NBC News does not have early voting data because the states haven't reported any results. However, each of these states voted for Donald Trump by at least 15 points in 2020, and there's no reason to believe they won't back him by a wide margin again once all the votes are counted. To keep things moving, I'll skip a detailed analysis of every safe state for each candidate. For former President Trump, early vote data suggests Republicans should dominate in the following states as expected: Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and Alaska. Across the Great Plains, we have North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska statewide, along with the 1st and 3rd districts, Kansas, and Oklahoma. In the South, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and South Carolina are all showing their traditionally strong Republican support, while in Appalachia, West Virginia, and Indiana round out the list. Each of these states supported Trump by significant margins in 2020 and hasn't voted Democratic since at least 2008. Early voting numbers already show Republicans are already jumping out to massive advantages in every single one of these states, leading by margins of around 15 to 40 points. Together, they account for 125 electoral votes. Remember, 270 is the magic number needed to secure the White House. Now, as for Kamala Harris, Democrats hold strong early leads in several deep blue states as well. Down the Pacific coast, we have Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. Moving east, Illinois stands as the only solidly blue non-coastal state, while the rest of these Democratic strongholds are in the Northeast: New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Joe Biden carried all these states by at least 15 points in 2020, and none have voted Republican since 1988, 8 cycles ago. And again, Democrats are expectedly leading in the early vote here by very, very wide margins. Together, they lift Kamala Harris ahead of Trump now with 180 electoral votes. That leaves 17 more competitive states that we'll now take a deeper look at. Let's start with Nevada, where the early vote numbers have generated more attention than any other state this cycle. Typically at this point, we'd be discussing the Democratic firewall here and whether Republicans could close the gap on Election Day. Yet with nearly 600,000 ballots already cast, almost half the total expected vote, Republicans are currently outnumbering Democrats by 6 percentage points. This is arguably the most concerning early data point for Kamala Harris's campaign this cycle. In 2020, the final early vote tally in Nevada, totaling 1.3 million votes, favored Democrats by 4 points, which allowed Biden to hold Nevada in the Democratic column by 2.4%. However, Nevada has shown a gradual Republican shift relative to national trends. In 2016, Clinton won Nevada by the same 2.4% margin, despite a narrower national popular vote margin, and in 2022, Republicans capitalized on this trend by flipping the governor's office. Current polling has Trump leading Harris by 0.9%, based on 43 surveys in the Decision Desk HQ polling average. In a race as close as this, Democrats simply have to start chipping away at this Republican early vote advantage in the next week, or we could see Trump overperforming not only in Nevada, but potentially in other battlegrounds as well. For now, I'm placing Nevada in the tilt Republican column, with Trump the slight favorite here. Moving on to Arizona, another highly competitive race in the Southwest. In 2020, Arizona was the second closest state by margin, with Biden carrying it by just 0.3%. His victory can be attributed to the rapid growth and diversification of Maricopa County, encompassing the Phoenix metro area. High turnout among Hispanics and college-educated voters ever so narrowly tipped the county and thereby the state at large into the Democratic column. Now, early vote numbers indicate Republicans are on track for a strong showing here again, leading Democrats by 6 points among the 1.2 million mail-in and early in-person votes cast, currently at 42% Republican to 36% Democrat. Comparing this to the 2020 election, where Republicans led Democrats by only 3 points, 38% to 35%, out of the 2.8 million early ballots returned, we see Republicans overperforming that number by 3 points. This shift is significant, as given Biden's slim 0.3% margin of victory in 2020, any Democratic slippage in Arizona could prove fatal for the party. Polling data also supports this trend, with Trump currently leading Harris by 1.9% based on 59 polls. Notably, Arizona has been the one core battleground state where Trump has consistently polled even with or ahead of Harris since Biden exited the race. So we'll place Arizona in the tilt Republican category, joining Nevada. Barring dramatic improvement in Democratic early vote turnouts, Trump is favored to carry both states. Next are Colorado and New Mexico. 2020 notably marked the first time in over 50 years that Colorado voted to the left of New Mexico as it trended hard to the left to favor Joe Biden by almost 14 points. Whereas he only carried New Mexico by 11%. Yet in terms of the early vote here, so far, Democrats outnumber Republicans by 12 points in New Mexico right now, and by a narrower 2 points in Colorado. I should note here that historically, Colorado's independents, which account for the plurality of votes cast thus far, are strongly left-leaning. Back in 2020, the early vote suggested Democrats also only had a 2-point advantage over Republicans, with 40% of those ballots returned by independents. Yet again, Biden won by 13.5%. So going back to our electoral map, now I'm going to place both states in the safe blue column, as Democrats are on track to match their 2020 margins. Wrapping up the Southwest with Texas, the second largest electoral prize on the map, worth 40 votes. With just the first few days of early voting, Texas has already seen over 4 million ballots cast, more than any other state. Republicans currently hold an 18-point lead in the early vote, with 54% to 36% over Democrats. In 2020, when Trump won Texas by 5.6%, the narrowest Republican margin in Texas this century, the early and absentee vote leaned Republican by 17 points, with over 9.5 million ballots cast. So the early 2024 numbers we're seeing here seem to track pretty closely to 4 years ago, as Republicans are up about a point here. Likewise, in the poll average, Trump leads by 6.6% over Harris based on 18 polls. Also, a 1-point overperformance relative to the 2020 margin. And with Hispanic voters continuing to trend Republican, it's increasingly likely that Democrats hit their ceiling in Texas in 2020 and may struggle to improve on that performance this cycle. So based on these factors, we're going to place Texas in the likely Republican category. Alrighty now, shifting over to the southeast, here in Florida, another state where the first few days of early voting have produced a substantial tally of almost 4 million ballots returned. Republicans lead here as well by a 9-point margin, accounting for 44% of the votes cast so far compared to Democrats' 35%. This is yet another concerning data point for Kamala Harris, as back in 2020, when Trump carried Florida by 3.5 points, Democrats led the final early vote tally, totaling more than 9 million by 1 point. The Florida Democratic Party has simply had a miserable time here over the last few years. Republicans have registered far more voters since 2020, and the state has trended as hard to the right over the last few cycles as any other state. Remember back in 2022, Republicans saw a localized red wave here as Florida re-elected Governor Ron DeSantis and Senator Marco Rubio by landslide margins of more than 15 percentage points each. And now in 2024, the polls suggest Trump might win Florida by the largest margin for a presidential candidate in decades. Back on our map, Florida joins Texas in the likely Republican category. Next up is Georgia, the closest state in 2020, where Joe Biden flipped the peach state blue for the first time in 30 years, winning by a razor-thin margin of 0.2%. Similar to Arizona, Biden's victory could be attributed to the rapid growth and diversification of its largest population center, Atlanta, where record turnout among Black voters tipped the state ever so slightly in Biden's direction. One of the stories of this election cycle is the potential for radical racial depolarization as Black and Hispanic voters trend toward Trump. Polling crosstabs between October 16th and 31st indicate that Trump is up by over 20 points on average among Black voters relative to 2020, a shift that could be particularly detrimental to Democratic chances in Georgia. This trend is also reflected in the overall numbers, as the latest polling average shows Trump slightly favored, leading Harris by 1.3% based on 55 polls in the Decision Desk HQ average. In terms of early voting, Georgia is again seeing a record number of ballots cast early, with early voting surpassing halfway to the total turnout of 2020. So far, around 2.8 million ballots have been cast early or by mail, with Republicans leading by 4 points, 49% to 45%. Interestingly, this is a relatively positive sign for Democrats. Back in 2020, Republicans outnumbered Democrats by 8 points in early voting out of 4 million ballots. While Democratic numbers are probably still inflated due to the overrepresentation of mail-in ballots, which tend to be cast first and lean far more Democratic, the Harris campaign will take the positive indicators where they can get them at this point. For now, we'll keep Georgia in the tilt Republican category on our map as we continue to monitor these numbers over the next week. Now moving up the southeast coast to North Carolina, worth 16 electoral votes and another core battleground. Democrats need to build a solid early voting lead here, as rural Republican-dominated areas are expected to swing hard for Trump on Election Day. So far, however, Democrats are once again underperforming, trailing Republicans by 2 points among the 2.5 million ballots cast so far. Early voting in North Carolina has been complicated by court rulings concerning RFK Jr.'s status on the ballots, and of course, the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, which temporarily closed some early voting sites. Still, the sample size of 2.5 million votes casts valuable insight. In 2020, Democrats built a firewall of 5 points over Republicans headed into Election Day among roughly 4.5 million ballots, but Trump ultimately won the state by more than a point. So again, Democrats are currently underperforming their 2020 numbers in a state where they need high turnout to remain competitive. Trump leads Harris by 1.5% right now in an average of 59 polls. So North Carolina will join other Sunbelt states in the tilt Republican category on our map. We have 9 states to go now, with former President Trump leading in the race to 270 electoral votes, with 244 over Kamala Harris's 195. Let's turn to the Midwest, starting with Harris's running mate, Tim Walz's home state of Minnesota. In 2020, Joe Biden carried Minnesota by a 7-point margin, with Democrats leading the early vote by 13%. Today, with nearly 1 million ballots returned, Democrats lead Republicans by 22 points. This lead has slightly narrowed over the last few days as the first waves of mail-in votes have given way to early in-person ballots. Still, on our electoral map, we'll place Minnesota comfortably in the likely category for Harris and Walz. Now turning to Iowa and Ohio, these are 2 of the fastest right-trending states in the country. Both voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and then again in 2012, before Donald Trump won them by at least 8 points in both 2016 and in 2020. As of today, Democrats hold a 4-point lead over Republicans in Iowa, with 300,000 ballots returned. This is another significant underperformance for Democrats compared to 2020, when they led early voting by 12 points before Election Day shifted the state to an 8-point win for Trump. Over in Ohio, Republicans are actually underperforming a bit. They lead Democrats among the 2.3 million ballots returned so far, but this is a 1-point drop from the 10-point early vote lead Republicans had in 2020 among the 3.3 million early ballots cast. While Republicans still have time to build on this margin, there's also some evidence that Democratic losses in Ohio and broader Appalachia may be slowing. Democrats saw minor gains in suburban areas in the 2022 midterms, and currently Trump leads Harris by about 6 points in Ohio, based on an average of 14 polls. Notably, each of the last 7 surveys shows Trump slightly underperforming his 2020 margin of 8 points. So, on our map, Iowa will go into the safe Republican column, while Ohio remains in the likely Republican category for now. Now let's focus on the core Upper Rust Belt trio, the WIMPA states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which will again play a decisive role in this race. These states have voted together in every election since 1988, backing Democrats every time until they narrowly flipped to Trump in 2016 by less than a point, giving him the necessary votes to reach 270. However, they all flipped back to Biden in 2020, securing his path to the presidency. Now again, for the 2024 election, both candidates' paths to 270 likely hinge on winning at least one of these states. For Kamala Harris, she might need all 3. Even if Trump were to sweep the 4 Sun Belt battlegrounds like he does here, Harris could still reach 270 electoral votes with a clean sweep of the Rust Belt states. Starting in Wisconsin, it's generally considered the most Republican-leaning state of the upper Midwest trio, demographically and fundamentally. Wisconsin has consistently voted to the right of Michigan and Pennsylvania in recent cycles, and its wider, more rural population makes it especially sensitive to Trump's strength among white working-class voters. In both 2016 and 2020, Trump notably outperformed the final polling averages here by over 6.5 points. In 2016, he trailed Clinton by around 6 points. And in 2020, Biden led by over 8 points, yet Trump now holds a slim lead of 0.4% over Harris in the 2024 polling average based on 67 surveys. On the early voting side, the initial mail-in ballots gave Democrats a head start, but the advantage has narrowed as early in-person voting has continued. With over 800,000 ballots counted, Democrats lead Republicans by 12 points, a margin that continues to shrink daily. For comparison, Republicans outpaced Democrats by 8 points in the nearly 2 million votes returned before Election Day in 2020. It's simply a matter of waiting to see if Republicans can overtake Democrats in early voting, and then by how much. Current betting markets on Polymarket suggest that Trump holds a 57% chance of winning Wisconsin, and I tend to agree with the public's consensus. For those who've been following, I've consistently been skeptical of Harris's chances here, even when she led earlier in the cycle. So for now, I'm placing Wisconsin in the tilt Republican category on our map. It's a different story in Michigan, where I've generally been more optimistic for Harris than the general public. Michigan is fundamentally the bluest of the 3 WIMPA states, having backed Biden by nearly 3 points in 2020, and Democrats have performed strongly in down-ballot races since then. The latest polling average via Decision Desk HQ has the 2 candidates in an exact tie based on their 64 poll average, with the lead continuously flipping back and forth over the last few weeks. In terms of the early vote, almost 1.5 million votes have already been returned, and Democrats hold a 14-point advantage, 52% to 38%. Again, this Democratic edge is narrowing on a daily basis. Back in 2020, when Biden won Michigan by 2.8%, it was Republicans who outnumbered Democrats by 2 points among the 3.2 million early or mail-in votes. So with that in mind, I'm going to place Michigan down as tilting Democrat for Harris here right now. I think if we do see these 3 states split, the most likely to diverge are Wisconsin and Michigan, whereas Pennsylvania will vote somewhere in between. Speaking of Pennsylvania, it's the most essential battleground on the map, worth 19 electoral votes. Nate Silver's latest presidential forecast gives Pennsylvania a 31% chance of tipping the election either way, with both Harris and Trump's odds of securing 270 electoral votes skyrocketing to nearly 90% should they carry Pennsylvania. The polling average currently shows Trump leading by 0.2% based on 88 polls, more than any other state. The margin has hovered within the realm of a typical polling error since Harris took over as the Democratic nominee. Simply put, Pennsylvania is truly as purple as it gets, a true 50-50 battleground. In terms of early voting, 1.2 million ballots have already been returned. Pennsylvania doesn't have traditional early voting. Voters must request a mail-in ballot in person at the county clerk's office. These ballots are expected to lean heavily Democratic, and the data reflects that 60% are from registered Democrats, compared to 30% from Republicans. So these early numbers will give us fewer clues here relative to other states, though it is still worth looking at the 2020 numbers, where we see a similarly wide Democratic advantage by 31 points here, 65% to 24%, among 2.5 million votes cast before Election Day. So at least for now, the numbers are tracking similarly to when Biden carried Pennsylvania by 1.2% 4 years ago. Now, I know some of you may groan in the comment section because of this, but I'm placing Pennsylvania firmly in the toss-up category on my map. There's just no clear favorite here at this point, unless, of course, you're viewing the race through your own blue or red-tinted glasses. That leaves us with the more Democratic-leaning secondary battlegrounds: Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, Virginia, New Hampshire, and Maine. Starting in Virginia, worth 13 electoral votes, about 1.5 million ballots have already been returned, and Democrats hold a shrinking 12-point advantage at 51% to 39%. Virginia voted for Biden by 10 points in 2020, the largest Democratic margin since FDR in 1944. With early voting making up more than half of the total votes in 2020 and leaning Democratic by 8 points, Democrats are on a strong track here, even accounting for the early inflation of mail-in ballots. I'll place Virginia in the likely blue column for Harris. Next, up in New England with New Hampshire and Maine, both states were decided by narrow margins in 2016, as Hillary Clinton narrowly held Trump off by less than 3 points. But they swung hard to Biden in 2020 by 7 points in New Hampshire and 9 points in Maine. The minimal early vote here so far currently favors Democrats by 6 points in New Hampshire and by 18 points in Maine. On our map, I'll place both states in the likely blue column for Harris. Maine and Nebraska split their electoral votes, awarding 2 to the statewide winner and 1 per congressional district. While we don't have early vote data broken down at this level, Maine's 1st district is always solidly blue, while the 2nd district voted for Trump by comfortable margins in the last 2 cycles. It's one of the whitest, oldest, and most rural districts in the entire country, suggesting it may trend even further to the right in the near future. As for Nebraska's 2nd district, it's almost entirely urban surrounding the city of Omaha, with a far more racially diverse population and a high proportion of college graduates. It voted for Biden by 6.5 points and is likely to trend further to the left this cycle. It goes likely blue for Harris here. So, based on an analysis of the early votes so far, Donald Trump is on track to win the election with 278 electoral votes to Kamala Harris's 241, and 19 votes in Pennsylvania placed in the toss-up category. We continue to trend towards an extraordinarily close final outcome. Make sure to subscribe to my channel below for more updates as we get closer to Election Day.